Everyone tells you the same thing when your number ticks up. Get retested, see a specialist, don't wait. What nobody tells you is that this reflex, test, refer, biopsy, repeat fires off whether or not the rise actually means anything serious. And I believed for years that racing straight to panic was simply being responsible. It wasn't. I'm 83, and it took me most of a decade to learn that a system reacting to a rising number and a number that actually spells danger are two completely different things nobody had ever separated for me. In the next few minutes, I'll show you exactly why that automatic treadmill exists and what actually got me off it. These days, I still get my number checked every single year, right on schedule, but I don't lose the week before the draw anymore. I ate a full breakfast this morning before my last appointment, something I couldn't have done a few years back. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because I spent a long stretch of my life assuming the panic was just part of the deal, when it never had to be. There's a particular kind of dread that has nothing to do with pain. It's the sight of the lab's name on your phone screen, hours before you've even opened the result, your chest already tightening around a number you haven't seen yet. I couldn't eat the morning of my blood draw for 3 years running. My wife would set toast in front of me, and I'd just push it around the plate, rehearsing what I'd say if the number had jumped again. And when it did jump, even a little, the response was always the same. Another test, a referral, a biopsy scheduled almost automatically, like a conveyor belt that started moving the moment the number crossed a line, whether or not anyone stopped to ask what that specific rise actually meant for me. Nobody sat down and explained the difference between a number trending up and a number that spelled disaster. There simply wasn't time in the room for that conversation. I want to be fair to the men and women running that system. They're not lying to you. They're not steering you toward a scalpel for profit, whatever the angrier corners of the internet might claim. What they actually have is 8 minutes, a checklist, and a waiting room full of other men with their own rising numbers. The honest explanation of what a number really means doesn't fit into 8 minutes, so the system defaults to the safest, fastest next step. Test again, refer, biopsy, repeat. It's not malice, it's arithmetic, and men like me get carried along by it without ever being told there was another way to think about the whole thing. That's the testing treadmill. Not one bad doctor, not one greedy hospital, a structure that quietly assumes every rising number is a 5-alarm fire, because a 5-alarm fire is the only scenario the 8-minute appointment has time to plan for. I spent years walking that treadmill, and I never once asked whether I could simply walk more slowly. For years, one number ran my life, the PSA. It would tick up a point, and I'd lie awake the whole night, certain it meant the worst, picturing the biopsy, the knife, the end of everything. Then someone finally told me the truth no doctor had. That number doesn't measure cancer. It measures your prostate. And as we age, it climbs mostly because the gland is simply enlarging, benign, swollen, and uncomfortable, not the worst. The number was scaring me half to death over something ordinary. And the prescriptions they push to shrink it? They can flatten your drive completely, soften everything, quietly take the man right out of you. I wasn't willing to trade that away. There's a gentle way to support that gland, keep it comfortable, a healthy size, without surrendering any of that. Keep getting checked every year, of course. At 83, that number doesn't own me anymore. I finally have peace. Let me show you what gave it to me in this video. And if you want the simple support I personally use, there's a free presentation linked in the description below. Here's what nobody sat me down and explained, and what I eventually had to go find on my own. That number doesn't measure cancer. It measures the prostate itself, how active it is, how much it's grown, how inflamed the tissue happens to be that particular week. With age, the number climbs in the overwhelming majority of men simply because the gland is getting larger, a slow and completely ordinary process, and because low-grade inflammation in that tissue rises and falls the same way inflammation does anywhere else in an aging body. A cold, a long bike ride, even a restless week can nudge that number without a single cancer cell involved. Understanding that didn't make my number stop existing. It made the number stop feeling like a verdict. Once I actually understood the mechanism, the treadmill itself looked different to me. The problem was never the testing. Testing catches real problems early, and I will never tell you to skip it. The problem was the total absence of context around the testing, nobody explaining that a rise is common, that biopsies carry their own real risks and discomforts, that elevated and urgent are not the same word, even though the system often treats them as if they are. I wasn't panicking about my prostate, I was panicking about a number I'd never been taught how to read. What finally started pulling me off that treadmill wasn't a new test or a different specialist. It was something almost embarrassingly simple that a retired urologist friend of mine mentioned almost in passing one evening, that the chronic stress and the sleepless nights sitting around every appointment were doing their own quiet damage, separate entirely from whatever the number itself was doing. He explained it plainly. Poor sleep and ongoing stress keep the body's cortisol running high night after night, and chronically elevated cortisol feeds general inflammation throughout the body, the same broad inflammatory load that's associated with pelvic discomfort and tension in men my age. This isn't about the number on the lab report. It has nothing to do with cancer risk, and nobody with any honesty would tell you it does. It's simply the same physiology that makes a stressed, sleep-deprived body ache more everywhere, including low in the pelvis, showing up again in that particular part of an older man's life. So I stopped treating the night before my blood draw as a night to lie there rehearsing worst-case scripts. I built a plain wind-down routine, the lights down an hour before bed, no checking the lab portal after dinner, a short walk in the evening instead of pacing the kitchen, and a fixed bedtime I actually held to instead of scrolling until my eyes gave out. It felt almost too small to matter the first week. By the third week, I noticed I was falling asleep before I'd finished rehearsing the worst-case version of my next appointment, simply because I was too tired and too calm to get all the way through the script. I paired that with two other pieces that work as a system rather than standing alone, not because any one of them was going to transform anything by itself, but because the combination is what actually holds up over months instead of days. Cutting back on the fried food and the extra salt that had crept into my meals over the years, since that kind of steady inflammatory load is linked with rougher urinary symptoms in men with an enlarged prostate. A short walk most mornings, since staying physically active is tied to milder day-to-day symptoms as men age, and the walk itself became part of the wind-down as much as the exercise. And keeping a fixed, calmer bedtime instead of a different one depending on how anxious I felt that particular week. So the routine wasn't hostage to whatever mood the day had left me in. None of it promised to move my number. None of it was supposed to, and I want to be direct about that rather than let you read something into it that isn't there. It was aimed entirely at how I actually felt living inside my own body while the monitoring continued exactly as it always had, on the same schedule, with the same doctor, with nothing about the testing itself changed at all. My grandson asked me to go fishing with him 2 weekends ago, an early morning start I would have quietly dreaded a few years ago, simply because early mornings used to mean lying awake, replaying appointments in my head instead of sleeping. This time I slept straight through and was up before my alarm, glad for the extra hour on the water. I think often about a man named Fletcher, 71, who wrote to tell me his own story after finding one of my earlier videos. His number had ticked up twice in 1 year, and his clinic had already scheduled a biopsy before he'd had a chance to ask a single question about what the rise actually meant. He told me the week leading up to that biopsy was the worst sleep he'd had in a decade, and that by the morning of the procedure he'd lost nearly 6 pounds from simply not eating properly. Fletcher's biopsy came back benign. He was relieved, obviously, but he told me what stayed with him wasn't the relief. It was realizing how much of that month he'd spent in pure dread over something that turned out to be nothing at all. Weight lost, sleep lost, a whole month of his life spent bracing for a blow that never landed. He started asking his doctor pointed questions at every appointment after that, specific ones written down beforehand instead of the vague worry he used to carry in silently. And he built the same kind of evening wind-down I had, treating the stress itself as something worth managing, right alongside the testing he never once considered skipping. He told me something else that stuck with me. He said the hardest part hadn't been the needle or the waiting room chair. It had been the version of himself that showed up in the days before, short-tempered with his wife, distracted at work, running through the same catastrophic script on a loop. Once he had a name for that pattern, the testing treadmill and everything the 8-minute system left unexplained, he said he stopped mistaking his own anxiety for a medical fact about his body. If you're on medication for your prostate, your blood pressure, or your heart, please hear this clearly. Nothing here replaces your treatment or your screening schedule, and you should never stop or adjust a medication on your own. Keep getting your number checked every year with your doctor, without exception, exactly as scheduled. None of what I've described is a reason to test less. It's a reason to walk into testing calmer, better rested, and less consumed by a number you finally understand. Here's what I settled on: a few drops a day. And let me tell you why it works. One compound calms one signal, but a swollen prostate answers when several are calmed at once. The growth signal, the inflammation, the pressure inside it. So what I use concentrates them, working as one, the way the research actually uses them, not a single ingredient pretending to be enough. A gland that stays comfortable and a healthy size, fewer trips, and the quiet of no longer fearing that number. It leaves the man fully intact, none of that flattening the prescriptions can do. It's linked right under this video, go look for yourself. It won't replace your doctor or your yearly check. It supports the biology right alongside them. I'm 83, and that number doesn't own me anymore. What I want you to walk away with is this. The testing treadmill isn't evil, and it isn't optional to step off of entirely. But you can walk it at your own pace instead of being dragged along by a system that has 8 minutes and a checklist and no room left over for context. Ask your doctor what a specific rise actually means for you, specifically. Ask whether watching and retesting makes more sense than an immediate next step. And handle your own sleep and your own stress like they matter, because they do, whether or not they ever show up on a lab report. I think about the man I was, unable to eat breakfast the morning of a blood draw, certain that a rising number meant the worst. And I think about the man I am now, still getting checked every single year, still respecting the process completely, but no longer letting the week before an appointment steal my sleep and my appetite the way it once did. If you've ever felt your stomach drop at the sight of a lab's name on your phone, or lost sleep waiting on a number that turned out to mean nothing at all, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one myself. And if this kind of honest, specific explanation is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more of this ahead every single week.